This is my 2001 BMW 330 Ci. I bought this car about 6 months ago, and I plan on making it my track car. It's an E46 chassis, which is known to be one of the better chassis BMW has made as far as vehicle dynamics and stuff goes. And it's actually not that bad to work on. So in this video, I will be showing you kind of what state the car is in, what I fixed since I bought it, and what I plan on doing in the future. So I paid about $3,000 for the car, and it has 176,000 miles on it. So it's not totally ragged out. The car actually drove quite well during the test drive, at least a lot better than some of the other ones I drove. So I wasn't too concerned about some of the cosmetic stuff and little things that were wrong with it. I was mostly happy that it drove and shifted fine, and there were no apparent mechanical problems right off the bat. I plan on replacing pretty much everything in the car anyways, so a lot of the replacement items, even if they were in good shape, I would have wound up replacing them anyways. So first off, underneath the hood, I replaced pretty much the entire cooling system. This is a known weak point of the E46s, so I decided to play it safe and replace all the hoses, the thermostat, the water pump, and even the radiator, which I discovered that the stock one was cracked. It looked like it had frozen or something. But it wasn't leaking and it was holding temperature. I just decided to play it safe. So that stuff is pretty much all replaced. I'm putting on a new radiator fan. The stock one's a bit rusty and kind of heavy, and it was contacting the crank pulley. So I'm going with a slimmer one that should fit. I'm not too concerned about its size because I'm going to be spending most of my time at speed, and the full aluminum radiator should also help quite a bit. Next thing I did was rip out the PCV system. This is known to be another fault on these cars. Not really anything that will prevent you from driving, but it was just leaking like crazy. It had been 20 years, it had never been taken apart. So I ripped all that stuff out and I replaced it with a catch can and just rerouted it. It was pretty simple. So that stuff is gone. A bunch of the vacuum lines were rotted out, and I fixed those leaks. So that was definitely a good thing to do. The secondary air pump that injects air into the exhaust manifold, that was already gone when I bought the car. The previous owner had done that, thankfully. But if that was not done, I would have done it myself. Just an unnecessary thing for emissions, and it adds weight and stuff. You really don't need it. I had to fix a whole bunch of oil leaks. The oil filter housing was leaking, the PCV system was leaking, and under the intake manifold was just a mess. So I spent quite a while cleaning that out. And I also have an oil leak in the oil pan gasket, which I haven't fixed that yet. But the intake area is looking much better. And while I had the intake manifold off to replace those gaskets and clean stuff, I also decided to clean the whole manifold and the injectors. Those were pretty filthy. I used a 9-volt battery to open up the solenoids and then spray some cleaner through there. And there's a lot of gunk that came out, so that was a good thing to do. I replaced a bunch of O-rings and stuff as well. I replaced some of the power steering lines in the reservoir as well. It looked like it was leaking into the alternator, which wasn't great. The ignition system was actually okay. The coils and the spark plugs looked fine. My DISA and my idle air control valve were actually functioning just fine. Cleaned them out a little bit while I was in there. Lastly, the car had an AFE cold air intake installed in it. It looks nice, but I'm not really sure how much it's really doing, since the stock air boxes were actually designed pretty well. Moving on to the drivetrain, the transmission shifted quite well when I drove the car. The bushings are clearly worn out, and there's quite a bit of slop in the gears, so I'm gonna have to install some bushings and do a short throw shift kit while I'm in there. But for the track, I'm going to want to do a lightweight flywheel and a new clutch as well, since that'll really help roll through the gears quicker. The diff is not a limited slip. You can definitely notice there's some one-wheel peel going on, even though this car doesn't even make that much power. So it'd be good to either install a limited slip kit, or if I feel like going all out, I can do the M3 diff. So the body is admittedly not great. I'm not too worried about cosmetics because chances are I'm going to hit a barrier or another car at some point. So it's not the end of the world that there's some dings and stuff. There's a scratch along the side of the car. The front left fender is dinged up pretty good. The bumper is kind of loose. Front left headlight looks nice, but it's missing a couple attachment points. One big issue with the body that I didn't notice when I bought the car is that there's actually quite a large section of Bondo in front of the rear right wheel. The car is going to be getting a roll cage put into it. That should really help with structural rigidity. I'm still going to take off the side rails and stuff and just make sure it's not rusted worse than I thought, but from the looks of it, the rust isn't too bad. I'm guessing it was just a hit on the side of the car because it looks like this car has been dinged up in other places as well. So the brakes, they actually worked okay. They're a little stiff when I drove the car. I decided to rebuild all the calipers. So I did new boots and seals and rear pistons. Couldn't find the fronts for some reason. And I gave the calipers a coat of paint just to make it look nicer, and they were pretty rusty. New bleed screws, new bleed screw caps, new stainless steel brake lines, and I even got some brass bushings for the guides. The stock ones are made of rubber and they flex quite a bit, so this should help with brake feel as well. I had to remake some of the hard lines above the rear subframe because they were not looking too good, and when I tried taking one of the fittings off to do the stainless steel brake line, I actually twisted the line and it broke, so I really didn't have a choice there, unfortunately. Suspension is not great, but again, this is one of those things that I'm planning on replacing pretty much all of it, so I'm not worried about shocks and springs and sway bars and end links, stuff like that. The one thing I did have to replace right away were the front control arm bushings. I tried tightening my lug nuts and the whole wheel was moving back and forth about a half an inch or so. So I bought some solid offset front control arm bushings and installed those. So that should help fix the slop. It'll also add some caster in the front as well, which will change how the car responds to steering inputs. So the underside, it doesn't look great, but I don't see any evidence of rust getting through all the way. The subframe is not amazing, but that's going to come out and get sandblasted and probably powder coated. All those bushings are going to be replaced anyways, so it's got to come out at some point, and I'll check its condition then. The jack pads were missing. It's a little rusty under there, but the actual chassis, which is the important part, really didn't look that bad. The wheel wells inside, there's really no rust or anything like that. Moving on to the interior. It actually doesn't look that bad, all things considered. It looks like someone tried doing some reupholstering at some point, but it didn't really turn out that great. The seats are worn, just regular wear and tear. It's a 20-year-old car. It's not going to be great. The shift bushings are bad. It's pretty sloppy. The steering wheel is actually in good shape. Most of the controls seem to work fine. The radio isn't really working that great. I think the screen has some problems. But it doesn't really matter that much because most of this interior is getting ripped out anyways, and that'll help reduce quite a lot of weight too. I was getting water in my trunk when I left the car outside when it was raining, so it's probably leaking either from the sunroof or from the trunk somewhere. So lastly, I will talk about my future plans for the car. As far as the engine goes, it's really not worth doing much to these 3-liter M54 engines. The only thing I will change under the hood is the exhaust header. Right now there's a cat on there, so I'll be getting rid of that and going with a catless header. The AC was working fine, but I'm going to tear all that out, save quite a lot of weight there, and it's quite crusty anyways. In the interior, I will be doing race harnesses, racing seats, steering wheel, short throw shift kit, and of course, a full roll cage. The roll cage will add back in quite a bit of weight, unfortunately, but I think I still should be able to make the car overall lighter. With the suspension, probably coilovers, new sway bars, a thicker rear sway bar to dial out some understeer, end links, and pretty much all the bushings in the car. I already did the front control and bushings because I had to, but it's going to need all the other ones, like the subframe bushings and trailing arm bushings and everything. Speaking of the subframe, it's going to need the reinforcement plates welded in for the chassis. That's another issue that's known with E46s. I'll be welding in those plates once I get the subframe out to do all that stuff. It's pretty rusty, so I hope when I sandblast it, it'll wind up looking good, and I'll probably give it a powder coat. For the brakes, I'll have to see how they perform. I think starting with better pads and rotors will be a good place to start, but I'm not really sure that it's going to need a big brake kit or anything. This car is not light, but it's also not heavy. So as long as I don't get brake fade or anything like that, I think I should be fine. The tires, I have a new set of Nitto NT05s. They have a 200 tread wear rating, which is fairly sticky, not full-blown slicks or anything. I will be running the stock wheels, so there's really no point spending $1,000 on lightweight rims quite yet. Stock sizes for tires in this car are actually quite wide to begin with, so there's not really much of a reason to go any bigger. And then lastly, there's some exterior stuff. If I have time, I might fix up some of the dings and maybe do some paint. Do a sunroof delete. That's a lot of weight up high, you don't need it. Put a carbon panel in there maybe. The rear windows are kind of fancy. They have these motors that open them. Probably replace that with just a piece of plexiglass or something. But generally the body isn't going to change too much. Perhaps some vents to relieve pressure under the hood and in the wheel wells. A cutout in the front headlight for kind of a ram air intake maybe. But besides that, not really a whole much is going to change as far as the body goes. It's not registered. It's not going to be registered. It doesn't help that it's the middle of COVID and all the registration centers are pretty much closed. So that kind of threw a wrench in the mix. Not to mention it's currently late August and the season's ending. So I'm going to take pretty much the whole winter to rebuild the car. So there's really no point getting on the streets anyways. But that's pretty much where I'm at. And thanks for watching.